Hello, and welcome to DSA Presents. I'm Deirdre Silverman, and my guest today is René Rojas, a fellow DSA member and sociologist who teaches in the Human Development Department at SUNY Binghamton. We're going to be talking about the issues related to policing in the U.S., the current protests about the police, and how we got here and what alternatives there are. So René, do you want to begin by talking about your background and your interest in this issue?
Sure. Well, I am originally from Chile in South America, though I did grow up in the US. In fact, I grew up in Houston, Texas. But after college, I returned to Latin America. I was an activist for years in different countries, in Guatemala, Mexico, my home country of Chile. And then I returned to the US about 20 years ago, actually a little less, about 15 years ago. I did a PhD at NYU in sociology. While I was in New York City, we lived in the Bronx in a fairly rough, what might be called a rough neighborhood. And during my years in New York City, I got involved in local activism, both labor organizing and struggles, and also more community organizing type efforts in my section of the Bronx.
And what brings you to the issue related to policing?
Well, a few things. One of the things I do research on and I teach about are social movements, both globally and in the US. And the magnitude of the protests that were sparked by the killings of George Floyd and others before him have really been something unprecedented. So I've been paying close attention to this. Also, as a socialist, as a member of DSA, it's obvious that the groundswell of organizing, right, and the growing participation of young people in the protest, wanting to address the issue of police violence in poor, predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, means that it's something that I think all folks on the left, all radicals, need to get involved in, need to try to wrap their heads around and contribute the most productively as possible.
And what's your analysis of how we got to where we are now?
Well, before reviewing some of the, I think, different accounts of police violence, or what explains, right, the levels of police brutality and associated phenomena in the US, like mass incarceration, it's worth, I think, reviewing just empirically, right, the facts of what occurred, largely since the killing of Floyd in Minneapolis, but even before, with the killing of Breonna Gray a couple months before then. I think it's important to situate, right, both the aggressive police behaviors that we're seeing and also the responses, the mass protests that reacted to this kind of police violence. It's important to situate these phenomena in what has been happening currently in the US. And what I'm talking about is the double crisis, right? The health crisis unleashed by the COVID pandemic, which has laid bare a lot of the disparities, a lot of the vulnerabilities among working people, among the poor in the US. So that on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, the massive economic crisis that the pandemic detonated for the past 3 months. So I think we can't lose sight of those background conditions when trying to make sense, again, of both aggressive policing, and more importantly, the protests that responded to these killings. Fact of the matter is that the neighborhoods, right, where police violence is most prominent, the demographics that it afflicts the most severely, are also the neighborhoods and the social groups, the social demographic categories, if you will, that were the hardest hit by this double crisis, the health and the economic crisis that followed. So I think in many respects, the protest, right, responding to the video, which once again, right, was this graphic depiction, which everyone unfortunately was able to and had to watch, right? One more instance of police abusing of and ruthlessly murdering a defenseless Black resident of these poor cities and urban areas, right? That can't be divorced from this context. These are the same, the very areas in which the policing is the most aggressive, the most deadly. Again, to repeat, are the same areas that have been hit by the health crisis and where unemployment grew the most and grew the fastest. So these are economically depressed areas that became even more vulnerable once the crisis hit. Within that environment, right? I think it shouldn't be so surprising that there was this mass response. In other words, people's natural kind of denunciation, natural disgust at one more episode of police violence was amplified, right, by the overall desperate conditions in which people have been forced to live under since the crisis hit hard, right? And of course, it's no accident that these episodes often involve, right, people that, not in every case, but quite often involve individuals who have been the hardest hit by difficult economic conditions, by joblessness, by funding cuts in major cities, and who have been pushed into the margins of the informal economy. And so the more you see that kind of social deterioration and those kinds of crisis conditions affecting people in urban areas, the more you see both aggressive policing, right? And also you see the anger bubbling up in response.
But right now, the protests have spread beyond those communities. And you have unprecedented numbers of middle class and upper middle class people, I think unprecedented numbers of white people participating. That the issue of police brutality has broken through in a way that it hasn't before. And some of it, of course, is due to the very graphic, horrible nature of that video with George Floyd. But we think there's more to it than that, don't we?
Absolutely, and I think it's worth going over some of the numbers. So the protests that responded to Floyd's killing, right, and again, which are responding not just to that one individual incident. This is the police killings themselves are a pandemic, right? There's a string of these types of events. As I said, are really unprecedented. And then they're unprecedented in a number of ways. First of all, the total number of people protesting really dwarfs anything we've seen during waves of prior protests in American history. I think estimates range from 15 million to 25 million actual participants, people who have gone out to protest. And of course, the protests, while they began in large cities, they weren't confined to large cities. So they also spread territorially throughout the country geographically. And I think somewhere around 2,000 or more cities, small towns, and even rural areas have seen protests over the last few months. So the scale of this is something that we haven't seen. At the same time, as you point out, Deirdre, it has reached a form of political and moral legitimacy, right? That is very comprehensive as well, very, very far-ranging. I think all demographic groups and surveys, I think the Pew Center did a survey, and they found that all at least racial groups, right, are heavily in support of the demands, or at least support the protest, the Black Lives Matter protest. Among white Americans, it's, I think, 3/5 of the population either strongly support it, or just more, support it a little more mildly. But overall, there's wide-ranging support. And of course, among other racial groups, the level of support is even higher. So, I was looking at comparable statistics, at least in terms of the episodes of major protest. I was looking at prior waves of protests in the US, right? And before this protest wave hit, one of the major ones in our recent history has been, of course, the civil rights movement of the late 50s and 60s. And I was surprised to find that as massive, right, as influential, as disruptive as the protests were during the civil rights movement, right, they really pale in comparison, at least numerically, right? They pale in comparison. To give you a sense, there were major campaigns in '63, and these were the kind of coordinated efforts to push for the civil rights legislation and the civil rights law of 1964. And then there was another one a bit later, late '64, early '65, I don't remember, again, intended to push for the Voting Rights Act, right? These are major efforts by the civil rights organizations. And I think at their height, in those two kind of cycles of protest, and each year there were 70 major episodes of protest, right? And in a few months, we've already had, of course, they're not all major, we've already had 2,000 episodes of protest. So it gives you a sense of the scale, the magnitude of what we're experiencing. Again, we haven't seen this in 4 decades in the US.
So I can tell you, as somebody who's old enough to have been alive then, that the protests did not get to the small towns.
That's right.
Did not get to rural areas of the country except in the South.
Yeah, and of course, one of the difference. Sorry, go ahead.
That there wasn't the kind of wide involvement that there is now.
That's right. That's right. I think that's one major difference, right? The breadth of involvement, which again is not confined, is not restricted to a certain demographic. You have all racial groups, and also cross section of class, or if you want to say income groups over the course of the protest. I think originally the first days of protest were largely featured, right, urban, poor and downwardly mobile youth, right? But since then, it's, as you said, exploded across all income groups, all class distinctions, and all racial demographics. That's one big difference. The other one is the relative spontaneity of these protests, right? Where it's happening in a decentralized fashion, and it's just spreading like wildfire, where a couple of maybe local activists, right, take the initiative, but there's so much kind of spontaneous support for this that people come out in droves. Whereas, during the civil rights era, right, the big campaigns, the Selma campaign, for instance, these were heavily coordinated. That's not to say that there wasn't spontaneous kind of support and sentiment from below that were driving African Americans in the South to participate, but organizationally speaking, right, it was mobilized in a very coordinated fashion. So that's another big difference between then and today. And it opens, I think, all kinds of opportunities to for progressive organizations to somehow harness, support, right, the sentiment and push it toward radical reform.
So the demonstrations so far have obviously focused on race and the role of police in enforcing racial disparities. But there are other ways to look at it. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I'll say as a side note, I'm glad you asked, because the environment for a while, right, was such that it was hard to present, different views, different explanations of what was going on, because of the dominance, right, of accounts that centered around race and racial oppression. Now I think, the very prolongation of the protest, right, have called into question a number of related things, which has opened up a space, right, for people on the left to present alternative, sometimes competing, sometimes opposing views, right, which I think is much more healthy for both our debate and analysis, and also for the organizing that's to follow. So I want to just, and I'm kind of caricaturing here, but you might say that there are, you could group explanations of what's going on into two big categories, right? The first, which is, I think, still very dominant on the left, is one that emphasizes continuity over history, right? It's one that says, well, police are today behaving so aggressively, and in particular are targeting, right, in a disproportionate sense, communities of color, and especially African Americans, right? Because this is what police or the predecessors of policing institutions have done throughout American history. This view holds that this kind of aggressive, right, and brutal behavior, right, is hardwired into American institutions. And the reason for that is that as a class society, a very unequal society, elites have always, right, since colonial days, since days of, slavery in the South, and then post-slavery Jim Crow in the South, right, have always organized police forces to protect their interests and suppress poor and working people, right? So again, it's a continuity thesis. This view holds that police departments today, and there are a modern iteration, right, of the slave patrols, under pre-Jim Crow, in the pre-Jim Crow South, that again were tasked with putting down rebellions by slaves. They're also the inheritors, for instance, of the Pinkertons, right? Armed forces that were organized and hired by industrialists, by employers, to put down labor unrest. And if you look at American history, right, both of those phenomena were very prominent. I mean, in the late 19th century, the standard response by employers to labor unrest was murderous repression. I mean, that's what the Pinkertons did. If you look at the big railroad strikes of the 1890s, dozens of workers just getting mowed down, right? So this view holds that cops today are just a continuation of that phenomenon. Again, they're here to uphold the interests of capitalist elites. And because American capitalism, from this perspective, is largely rooted in, right, and embedded in white supremacy, right, then of course, cops will disproportionately target African Americans in order to establish and uphold, I should say, white supremacy, the dominance of white, wealthy whites over people of color and African Americans in particular. Right? That's one account. I think it's quite dominant on the left, and again, it stresses these continuities throughout history. But there are other ways of explaining police brutality, and its kind of cousin phenomenon, which is mass incarceration, right, in American society, that doesn't necessarily associate these phenomena, right, with things that happen almost in a trans-historical way throughout American history. The kind of this alternative view prefers to center its attention around shifts in American political economy since the 60s and 70s, and in particular, the impacts that these shifts had on American cities, right? And from this perspective, you know, policing, the emergence of superfunded police departments, the emergence of murderous, brutal police practices, and of course, it's this, you know, associated phenomenon of mass incarceration is not an iteration of something that existed way back in colonial times and has just morphed its way through American history. It's actually a phenomenon that emerges because of the particular conditions of American capitalism in the post-war era, right? And from this perspective, what I think, you know, what folks say explain police brutality and mass incarceration is a few things happening at once. On the one hand, you had a late kind of wave of migration from the South, right, toward the North, toward the Midwest, and even toward Western urban centers. This is the latter half of the Great Migration of African Americans leaving Jim Crow, which had been defeated, and migrating to the cities. At the same time, however, right as they're entering the job markets in these cities, the American economy is being transformed dramatically by a few things: deindustrialization, right, automation, offshoring, right, moving industries to other countries or to other parts of the country, so that these latest entrants into urban labor markets, right, arrive right when the jobs disappear. What's the response?
Tremendous concentration of wealth.
Tremendous concentration of?
Wealth.
Well, yes. So what's happening exactly? This is when the post-war boom era, right, is going into decline, right? And there are a number of policies that do start to intensify economic inequality in a number of ways, right? What's happening at at the level of cities is that economic elites, right, start to move out of the cities right when the revenue, that might have been available through taxation, right, is most needed, because you have this influx of people without decent and dignified jobs and wages for them, right? And so middle-class professionals and wealthy people, mostly white, but not only, also African Americans, right, that had entered the middle class, start to leave the cities into the suburbs to escape, right, taxation, local taxation, property taxes, et cetera. So this is all a cauldron for very serious urban problems. First of all, just as you see.
I have to interrupt because we're almost out of time. I think what you've given us is a great introduction in terms of how we got to where we are now with regard to police issues and communities that the police are dealing with. And we'll have a part 2 program about where we go from here, the kinds of organizing, the kinds of potential that there are, and the kinds of changes that we want to see in both policing and the incarceration system, right?
Do I have 30 seconds to just wrap up?
Yes, you do.
Okay, because I realized I spoke too long on it. But ultimately, what ends up happening in urban centers in the US is jobs disappear, revenue of elites disappear. So you have these pockets of deeply, these concentrations of poverty, which do generate a lot of crime. Not through the faults of the residents in these neighborhoods, but because there aren't any job opportunities for them. So from this perspective, there's a way in which aggressive policing and even mass incarceration is responding, not in the way anyone would like, but is responding to growing rates of violent crime in general, but violent crime in particular in cities. And one of the reasons why that was the response from elites is because in the US, unlike other advanced capitalist democracies, we didn't have a labor party. We never had a socialist party that could actually fight for the types of reforms and the welfare programs which might have mitigated some of the consequences, right, of this crisis, the crisis of urban cities, right? And so the response by elites was, instead of funding generous, universal programs that could address these problems, was a cheaper alternative: heavy policing and mass incarceration. So we can pick up on that in part 2 and then talk about where we go from here.
Well, that's a great summing up. Thank you. I've been talking to René Rojas, sociologist at SUNY Binghamton. Tune in for part 2 of where we go from here in terms of policing. And thanks for watching DSA Presents.